Go ahead and start recording. And welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending the November 2021 Transceiver Guest Speaker Series. My name is Nick Travellini, and I am thrilled to welcome Alvin Harvey from MIT. He's a PhD candidate there in the Aeronautics and Astronautics Department, specifically working in the Human Systems Lab. He's a member of the Navajo Nation, and he's here to speak with us tonight about his work working to support Indigenous peoples and introduce anti-colonial methods into space exploration work and space science, and to develop space technology that will support tribal sovereignty. And I will just leave it at that. Thank you so much, Alvin, for coming out tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Colin, and thank you the rest of the team at the New School Policy and Design for Outer Space. Just reading about the work that you're doing and speaking with you, Nick and Colin, a few minutes ago, it sounds like you guys are doing some amazing work, and it really synergizes with the work that I'm doing here at MIT too. So it's a real pleasure to be here and speak with all of you. And I feel like, if you're a researcher, your past and what you're doing and how you're doing research and what you're researching on, like it's a winding road. And the path that I was on when you guys asked me to come and speak was very different from where I'm at right now. But I think that's just part of the process. And, if you want to speak about it in terms of being Indigenous, it's part of our methodologies of how we're applying ourselves and our worldview with different processes around us. So very happy to be here, but allow me to introduce myself in my traditional tongue and in a traditional way by saying my name in Navajo, introducing myself that way, and introducing my clan. So Yate she Alvin Harvey Yenishia, Tobaj na Ajanishle, Hananahi Bashichin, Biligana Dashiche, Ado Kia Ane Dashinele, Ukut Ego Dene Nishle. Yeah. So what I'm doing there is I'm introducing my name, I'm introducing my four clans. And the reason that you do that as a traditional Navajo person is to help find your relatives in the crowd. So you never know who you might have a cousin or maybe even an uncle out there. But, I try to do that even in these cases when I'm speaking to people that are Navajo to essentially establish and say that, when it comes to these wider problems of how we're looking at space technology and exploration and, what our future is collectively, I'll consider all of you my relatives in that case. And I also like to say that because sometimes I might be harsh and, the language and the critiques of how we're looking at space travel, but, at the end of the day, we're still relatives and we can still talk to each other that way and still have respect and, understand each other in that way. So again, I thank you, all of you, for being here. I've got a lot of slides to go to is what it feels like, probably about 25 of them. So I'll try to get to those and really capture the essence of, how I led up to this point, being an Indigenous person here at MIT, doing this type of research, what my research really is about, and really where is it heading now? I'm only a second-year PhD student, and it just now feels like I'm figuring out what I'm going to do, and what I'm going to do potentially for my career as well. So I'll go through those slides, and then I want to leave lots of room for Q&A. And yeah, any questions that you might have, I'd be happy to answer them as well. So let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen and get those slides up. Okay. Does that look all right?
Looks great. Very fancy.
Thanks. One thing I'll point out here is you can use yourself as a pointer if you really need to. So and some Zoom tricks I've learned. But allow me to start out with a really basic question that I was trying to answer myself my first year here at MIT, really. And coming from an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and then coming to aeronautics and astronautics here at MIT, so essentially aerospace engineering. And I took a few courses, and there was one course that I kind of took on a fluke, and it's taught by Dr. Danielle Wood in the Space Enabled Lab here at MIT in the Media Lab. And the course was essentially asking the question, what can space technology do to advance sustainability and justice? And I kind of took it for fun, but what I walked away from that was a real understanding that space technology can be interrogated in that way. So it's not just a utility for all the cool technical stuff or to make money, but it also can be used and critiqued and looked at as a way to advance justice and sustainability. And for me, the way that translated from myself, from my own worldview, was, well, okay, well, before we even get to that, like, what do my people, what do Native American people think about space technology? What are their perspectives there? I wanted to understand that first. So I'll kind of reiterate what my research question was, and this was probably about 2.5 years ago now, I think 2019, which feels like a long time ago now. But my primary research question was, what is Native American perspective on space technology and space exploration? And to narrow it down a bit more, I was more concerned about, what is the opinions and fears of what's going on? And this was at a time when things like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, which is in New Mexico, pretty close to the Navajo Nation, there was a lot of questions like, well, what is my people's opinion on all of that? Is there fears? Is there excitements? Like, I wanted to know more about that. And the reasons for that is based on my own experiences. Growing up, I say this now as kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but growing up, I had more experience and knowledge with the Bureau of Indian Affairs than I did with NASA. So I didn't get a lot of experience or exposure to anything aerospace related. I had exposure to some STEM, some engineering stuff, but a lot of it came from my experiences of living with my father and my grandfather, who were both farmers and ranchers, that really took the time to engineer things with their hands. And I learned a lot about, looking back on it now, kind of complex processes of, how do you care for yourself, your family, and then also the livestock and the land around you. And so, through all that process, like growing up and going through undergrad and, finally coming to MIT was when it felt like I had a real experience with aerospace technology. And that took like 19, 20 years of my life to finally get around to see something dealing with NASA. And so I knew that I wasn't alone in that respect. And I knew that, there's a lot of other much smarter Native American Navajo students than I am that, probably never had that experience either. And I wanted to, understand why that was, but also wanted to understand, like, well, what is their opinion, or what is their parents, or what is their grandparents, their elders' opinion about space technology? Because, for Indigenous people, that family connection, is really strong to the point where it's shaping your values as you live on. And as evidenced by me and, these pictures of myself with my dad and helping him out. And then here on the right with my grandfather, I don't know how old I was here, but I was helping him move around stuff at the farm. So, lots of motivation personally for this research question. And again, I'll kind of go back and reiterate the aspects of, what other motivation was there? And definitely in terms of STEM outreach, I wanted to understand, why did I grow up and never see anything NASA or, anything like that? I knew other people, and I knew my parents, grandparents had never experienced anything, dealing with STEM outreach in that way. And I also knew, like, growing up and, I say growing up like here at MIT in a certain sense, but being here at MIT, like there definitely was like a more pressed presence or a desire to have more diverse people, more diverse perspectives, because these are complex problems as you're dealing with, from my work, the human body or the human being in space, and that a lot of those questions require, really complex and diverse solutions. And the way that you get that is you have diverse people and diverse solutions coming from those people as well, and perspectives. And one thing growing up too, and then coming to MIT was, and growing in my knowledge of what's going on in the space world, was that there was a lot of like kind of rootedness in colonial thought. And I think more bluntly, what captures the essence of how people talked about space or continue to talk about space is it's like another frontier or a manifest destiny in a certain sense. And you see a lot of that, like even still today. I think it's becoming a bit more critique now because of how obvious and in your face it is at times. But, I think I definitely did want to understand, what are Indigenous people's perspectives and experiences with, space being talked about it in that way. So, when I was trying to figure out, what is this research question actually framed in the context of understanding? And I wanted to understand the perspectives on STEM. I wanted to understand what potential taboos or barriers there are for Indigenous people, and specifically Navajo people, entering into STEM. And I knew that there was attempts at outreach of STEM, but I also knew that many of them weren't sustained, and many of them went, unfortunately, unfunded as the years went on. And of course, I wanted to understand, what is the elders, what is the grandparents, the parents, the cousins, uncles, like, how does their perspectives on STEM influence someone's, own perspectives on STEM and even space? So I also put it on the space side of things. Like, I also knew that there was specifically space outreach programs that have been going on, but a lot of them have once again run into the same barriers of potentially not being sustained, potentially not asking the right questions, or even doing the outreach in a proper and respectful way. And I also knew from a lot of news reports about oppositions to space missions. So the Mauna 30-meter telescope opposition, and another incident called Lunar Prospector, which I'll talk about soon as well. So I knew that there was a lot of conflict in there, but I also wanted to understand what was the perspective on that conflict today. And of course, I wanted to understand what is the role of cultural-based views of space for Indigenous people as they're entering and seeing all these exciting rockets going up into space, and these conversations of it as if it was manifest destiny once again. So one blatant thing that I really came to understand, especially even just in conversations with my own family, that idea of kill the Indian and save the man was very much present in many different forms for young Indigenous people today. And I can speak to my own experiences, of course, of my father going to boarding school, and then both my grandmothers going to boarding school, where they're essentially forced to forget their language. And this wasn't 100 years ago. This was back in like 1950, 1955, around that time. So that type of generational experience, and in many cases generational trauma, has lived on, and it's kind of attached itself to education itself. And that can take many different forms. I know that education is talked about as something that's very positive, but there's always some hesitancy in terms of, where are we going to send our youth? And when they go to a place to learn anything that's not taught by our culture, is it going to be respectful to our own culture? Are they going to be able to maintain that culture, their respect for their community? And are they going to be able to remember their community as they're learning these other aspects of life? So again, that very presence, and you see a lot more focus on that in the news in Canada, but the presence and understanding of the impact of boarding schools and taking children away from their families at an early age, like going a couple generations back, definitely does have an impact on the perception of STEM and education. So this was another thing that I came up with as a result of that understanding of the generational kind of constructs of viewing education. And this is kind of also based on my own experience, as well as other Native American students like myself and their experiences. But definitely, as you're going through undergrad and as you're learning STEM-based education curriculum, is that you really see that there's a cultural divide. And I think, this is something that education specialists, as well as, traditional elders have critiqued at length, but it was something that I was discovering kind of firsthand, looking back at my own experiences in undergraduate school as a mechanical engineering student, is that, well, I always try to approach problems from my Native American perspective of what I was taught. Is I had to think about this technology and what I was doing as a way to help my family, or to help my community, or to help my people, essentially. And, that type of space and reasoning isn't really, given, I guess, enough room or space to develop as you're going through education as a STEM student. And so critiques of, applying your own worldview, essentially, and your own values, is that given space to develop? Is it given space to interact with what you're learning in STEM? I mean, not really, unfortunately. And definitely, we can talk about, really the colonial focus or the STEM focus on monetary value for objects. So, I mean, a lot of people are taught to develop technology, probably rightfully so in some respects, to get a good job. I mean, to make money in that respect. And, this also runs into the ideas of masculinity, how we're viewing the world and how we're processing technology in that respect as well. So essentially, I came to understand that there's a real cultural divide that, something that I'm focusing on in my own research. And how do you bridge these two worldviews, and how do you make them cohesive and sustained? I think cultural taboos certainly play a role. And I think specifically with aerospace engineering or space technology development, a lot of that goes back to developing technology that's going to benefit your community or your home or your people. I think even older Native American engineers, when they go back home, like they're probably still asked, what is this? What you're doing? Like, is it helping our community? Is it helping our people? Like, it's almost a taboo in its own rightful self of, doing something that is not to the benefit of your community or to, other people in a certain sense. So I know that in medicine and things like that too, like the culture taboos are really thick, and especially in dealing with the environment and especially botany, how you treat animals, how you treat the dead is like very much prevalent and in your face in that way with cultural taboos. But when it comes to you developing technology, a lot of the taboos, I guess you can say, is the idea that you're leaving your community. Are you going to come back? And is what you're doing going to help our people in our community and our family in that respect? So definitely something that considers and makes it a more well-rounded or more cohesive understanding. So I'll kind of quickly talk about these attempts at STEM outreach. What we see today even is a lot of these STEM outreach programs for Indigenous people are somewhat mentorship programs, usually sometimes one-offs. I know that the program that I'm in with the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, I mean, we have our own program where as Native American students, we have a program manager that links us up with a mentor that's been in the field or been in industry. And that's really new, is what it feels like. I think I'm only the second cohort of this program that's been around for probably 2-3 years now. But I mean, that's for like college students. And there's not much in terms of that for undergraduate students and matching them up with someone that is also their own cultural affinity or tribe in that way too. So something that we don't really see too much of, probably because it's pretty expensive to maintain and manage, which is understandable, but unfortunate in that case. Occasionally you'll see intervention programs where you have, again, one-off type of programs where you kind of see this in NASA every once in a while, where they'll hire a program manager to go out to a tribal community to go and meet and have kind of a presentation, or essentially come there to say like, hey, you as a Native American can come and speak here, or you can come and learn at NASA and become an engineer like these other folks. And usually those are just kind of one-off programs, maybe once every couple of years, nothing really sustained in terms of relationship. And then exposure, I think the exposure that Indigenous communities and STEM students, I guess, when you're early and young like that, is something that I spoke to earlier, where you don't get usually a type of exposure that people working at NASA, or if you're going to undergrad, they're expecting young STEM students to get. So I'll use my own perspective once again, but growing up, I never programmed anything. I never had an experience with robots. First time I had a computer was I was a senior in college. And so when I came to New Mexico State University, and one of my first classes was like, hey, you got to use this MATLAB programming. And I think I was one of the only people there that barely knew how to use a computer, I guess, in a certain sense, to like be asked to like suddenly know how to do programming like it was something I should have learned before was pretty disheartening, but we got through it. And these cultural based views of space is really interesting, and something that is what I'm incorporating into my own PhD research now. But I think what's at the core of the difference between, you can say, the Western view of space versus the Indigenous view of space is that with the Western view of space, like our consideration for our home environment, our consideration of what's sacred almost in a way for scientists and engineers and people here, like that sacredness or that protection, it usually stops at 100 kilometers altitude in the air. And whatever's beyond that, whatever's in space, is not really part of our environment. Whatever's up there is dead, or there's nothing alive up there, or it's so vast and so broad that we can throw anything up there and it's not going to really affect us in any sense. But contrastly with Indigenous people is that our views of what is sacred and what is supposed to be taken care of in a sustainable way doesn't just stop at 100 kilometers in the air. It also extends like into the galaxy, into what we're considering sacred and what we consider as part of our Mother Earth and our Father Sky, and how we view the environment. And so when we see that process and kind of conflict carried out, is it really, you really see these questions of both ownership, but also what is considered alive and sacred, and what is considered an environment. So definitely a lot of contrasting views in that point, but I'll talk about a few examples in a moment. So I knew that there was STEM-based space outreach programs. Actually, currently, this program is still occurring, from what I believe. But a lot of these programs are very astrobiology, astronomy focused. And I'll kind of quote a woman that I met with that actually runs one of these programs. She said that it's mostly applied with sciences. So nothing with engineering and STEM focused on that way. So the applied sciences. And yeah, I think she kind of recognized that there needs to be more engineering related space-based outreach for Indigenous youth and students and people. But there's a lot of room to grow in that respect. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or unsure of how do you actually approach this in a respectful way, which is a really interesting question in itself. So I'll speak about a little bit of the conflicts really quickly here, but there's this really in-depth conflict that is still ongoing, from my understanding, is the Hawaii's Mauna Kea and 30-meter telescope controversy. And so for those unfamiliar with it, there's $1.4 billion invested into this 30-meter telescope that they wanted to put on the sacred site in Hawaii. And it was done without consultation of the native Hawaiians there. And that led to this huge conflict and protest. And, they're still trying to build it, and it's still in a legal fight right now. But again, this is one of those conflicts where people look at and, say that, look, Indigenous people have a perspective and viewpoint on this space technology or this astronomy environment. And at the same time, people are trying to scratch their heads well, what can we do? How can we prevent this type of thing? Or, how can we build this relationship? Or is this even a repairable relationship at this point? So again, ongoing questions that are really relevant still today. And I like to throw this one in there to also mention that this isn't just a United States issue of Indigenous people against, or incongruent with in space technology or space exploration, but it's a worldwide problem. And there's Indigenous people in Siberia, there's Indigenous people in Australia, New Zealand, that are facing their own conflicts and problems with how people there, space technology engineers or companies or scientists, are doing it in a different way. And in the viewpoints of Indigenous people, in a disrespectful way that is both in a cultural and spiritual sense, but also in a way that's directly impacting their lives and how they're surviving as Indigenous people as well. So this is a conflict that happened, I think it's 22 years ago now. And it was a conflict between NASA and the Navajo Nation. So, me being Navajo myself, this definitely caught my attention as something that I was oh my God, like NASA or the Navajo Nation actually stood up for NASA, or stood up against NASA. And there was actually a resolution in this conflict, which was really fascinating. But to sum up the story of what had happened, is that there was this renowned planetary scientist named Eugene Shoemaker that was really instrumental in the training of Apollo astronauts back in the day. And unfortunately had passed away in a car accident in Australia. And a group of his family and friends got together and took a portion of his cremated remains and asked NASA at that time, back in 1998, to attach a portion of his ashes onto one of their new spacecraft that they wanted to send to the moon. And this was done out of a place of respect and honoring. And I think that people at NASA also felt the same way, which is why they included it on their Lunar Prospector spacecraft, which was actually designed to go to the moon, search for water, and eventually execute a controlled crash, I guess you can say, into the lunar surface. So that did happen, and there was a portion of remains on that spacecraft that is still up there to this day. But what was interesting is that when they finally publicly announced that this was happening, it was on the very day of the launch, and it was done by, I think, the administrator of NASA at some funding event in DC. And he said, we're actually honoring one of these famed planetary scientists by sending a portion of his remains up to the moon. And somehow that news actually got back to the Navajo Nation president at that time, Albert Hale. And to provide a bit of a cultural context, being Navajo myself, is that you have to have a lot of reverence and respect for the dead, and especially in terms of like avoidance, I guess, in a certain respect of all things that are dead, because there's a certain distance that you have to put yourself in between there out of respect and out of honoring for that person's spirit. And so anything dealing with cremated remains, anything dealing with the dead, it's like you have to be really careful with that. And you have to usually carry out a ceremony on yourself if you're going to be handling any of that type of material. Also, there's a lot of respect for the moon as one of our relatives. And so when Albert Hale, who's very traditional, heard about this, and he actually went and spoke with one of his Navajo medicine man advisors, like, you're taking something that is really dangerous to be handled, that you have to respect and care, like a person's remains, and sending that to the moon, which is another sacred place, like it was really taken as a firm disrespect. And understandably, it was taken as something that they were just flabbergasted that NASA would try to do that without consultation of them, the Navajo Nation, or other Native American people at all, because like it was very, very much understood that doing something like that was like lacking cultural competency for Indigenous people, not just in the United States even, but also throughout the world too. So Albert Hale at that time actually, stood up and made public statements, and he wrote a letter to NASA headquarters denouncing what they did. And I'll give props to NASA at that time, as they apologized and they said, next time we'll do better. And they actually invited Albert Hale to come speak with them in DC at the NASA headquarters. So usually that's where the story has like ended from like public news, is like, okay, like they apologized and that was it. And they promised to no longer send ashes to the moon. But there was actually a very deep, deep conversation that occurred because of this at NASA and between NASA and the Navajo people, which is something I'll speak about. So to NASA at that time, like this was very much a public relations disaster. We had one of the, like from their perspective, we had one of the largest Navajo, one of the largest Native American tribes in the United States speaking out and denouncing one of their flagship missions to the moon. And it came down from the administrator level to say, we need to fix the situation and come to an understanding with the Navajo people. And the way that they did that is they handed it off to some of the program managers for this lunar prospector mission. And they reached out to an educational specialist named Richard Shope at the Jet Propulsion Lab at that time to actually begin to repair and build this relationship and come to an understanding of why did this happen and then what can we do better in the future. And this is just kind of the front page of what had happened. I guess the report out of that is that NASA took some of the program managers for that mission. They took a Native American engineer from the Navajo Nation, and they also took this guy from JPL, and they built a relationship based on prior astronomy focused outreach that they had with some Navajo people there. And they went out to the community. They actually sat down with them in a Navajo hogan and came to an understanding of what had happened. And what I find fascinating about this this understanding in this meeting is it wasn't done, in a boardroom. It wasn't done with PowerPoints, and it wasn't done over email. It was done by having these community members, having these people from JPL, from NASA, and having them sit down together on the ground at an equal level in a circle to do a talking circle. And you probably in some way experience a talking circle in some respect of like everyone go around and introduce yourself and tell us something fun that you did. So with an Indigenous or Native American talking circle, it actually goes beyond that kind of introductions of ourselves, but it's also a good tool for understanding a conflict and to reaching a resolution, or perhaps not a resolution, but also the management of it. And what strikes at the core of these type of talks is usually what comes out is the actual feelings of how people felt about a particular conflict or incident. And that is just as important as the facts of what had actually happened. And so in this case, this talking circle ran by Joseph Chasing Horse from the Lakota Nation, the NASA and the Navajo community members, they came to an understanding of what had happened. So they came to an understanding of why culturally the Navajo people were upset about this incident. And they also came to an understanding of, well, what can we do in the future to make sure this doesn't happen again? And one of the resolutions that came out of this essentially was that NASA would take on more Navajo and Native American youth, teach them the STEM-based programming, the education, give that to them as a gift and apply it to them, but firmly with the caveat that they would not be forced to forget their culture or their community, or that they would be forced to leave their community. So again, just to summarize, this power of this talking circle is that you had, some pretty high level leadership at NASA come and meet with Navajo people in an indigenous way, in a Navajo way, and sit down and talk about this issue and this problem and actually reach a positive resolution. So it was really interesting to see that happening. So I'll kind of summarize what were some of the themes that came out of this. Definitely the value conflict, which I mentioned before in terms of conflict, but also how we're viewing STEM. The questions of empowerment and also potential about, how do we have Indigenous people more incorporated in NASA, and also empower them to be Navajo, to be Native American while they're there. And, aside from that, there was definitely a feeling of ambivalence, understandably, throughout this whole process that really came out, is that this was the federal government once again kind of violating the culture and the identity and the respect of Native American and Navajo people. So, from Navajo people's side at that time, it was a lot of like, oh, well, here we go again type of thing of, once again, that the federal government is violating, our agreements, our culture, and our worldviews. So that it was a really interesting conflict that, I think shows the value of the talking circle, shows that NASA can sit down, and also other space conglomerates or companies can sit down and have a meeting in an indigenous way, and the power of that to reach a resolution and to reach an understanding and to actually draw out what are the actual feelings of the people involved in this, and to draw out, not just the facts, but also the real understandings of what's going on with this conflict. So I think, this was back in like 1999 when this report came out, and, they wanted to definitely engage and involve the youth leaders that were there in a respectful way once again, and to invite Navajo and Native American people to participate directly in the space program. And from what I've been told by the individual that wrote this report is that that type of funding that they had, it dried up after a year, and NASA went on to do other different things. And so that's something we're still seeing the effects of that lack of that Native American presence today, particularly with private companies co-opted and funded by NASA to also send more ashes up to the moon. So you have companies like right now Astrobotic that is sending up a lunar rover to the moon with over 100 ashes of individuals, and not just individuals, but also people's pets. So I think there's a couple of dogs on there too. But one of the primary funders of that rover and of that mission is actually NASA. And so now there's rising questions again, revisiting this conflict of the understanding that NASA would incorporate more Native American people and their culture and what they're doing in consultation, but also on that promise that they originally made, that they would no longer do this type of thing without consultation. So again, revisiting old conflicts, but also I think we can revisit our old ways of doing the conflict management in this case. So actually sitting down and meeting and building that relationship with people and coming to an understanding of a resolution. So I think, I'll mention one, I guess more current incident. So something that not happening 20 years ago, but something that happened actually just past summer that I was really lucky to participate in, and it's called the SatCon 2 workshop. And to really summarize it, this is the second workshop where you have people from the satellite industry, astronomers, and for the first time, Indigenous people incorporated into this conversation of, what are the effects of satellite technology? What are the effects in terms of light pollution in our way of life? And I give a lot of credit to the other Indigenous people that I was lucky to meet and speak with during this conference. And I think, this is really, really a showing of the wider consideration. And you actually see it with, the program that I'm talking in right now, the new school policy and design for outer space, is that incorporation of Indigenous perspectives and knowledges as something that's not, fringe, or like something that's not, made up or fake or something like that, like a lot of engineers and scientists think about today, but something that enhances our perspective. It grounds our values. It gives us a leadership that is actually quite lacking in how we're viewing space technology and exploration. So I think there's a growing, understanding of that, and a growing like kind of hunger for that. So I think there is going to be a wider need for Indigenous people that aren't just Indigenous as their identity, but also Indigenous in their practices and what they're doing and how they're existing and leading in the space exploration industry as well. So this is something that I'll kind of highlight real quickly, because I really want to get to some questions and like some feedback. I'd love to, have a more conversation type of thing. I feel like, that I guess is my Indigenous way of speaking, is that you learn so much through just having conversations with people and asking questions, rather than me sitting here lecturing again. But this was something that kicked me off to my current trajectory of my research of, I looked at this research question, and, what I kept asking myself earlier is like, well, like if I can come to understand the perspective, which, I partially came to understand the utility and the power of Indigenous knowledges and ways of doing with the lunar prospector story. It's like, okay, well, how can I actually here at MIT, as someone that's on a satellite engineering project, how can I actually figure out how to use that technology to benefit Indigenous people, to benefit my community? And more broadly, how can space technology, and specifically for me, satellite technology, how can that advance tribal sovereignty? And I'll talk about why it was tribal sovereignty in just a moment. So tribal sovereignty is, something that is conferred, legally here in the United States through treaties and agreements in that way. And those are something that are continuously violated, typically most of the time, by the United States federal government as well as corporations. But currently there are 573 recognized sovereign tribes, and there are a lot more that aren't federally recognized that are currently fighting through that process to get federally recognized. But a large portion of these groups and organizations are actually located in Alaska. And again, I think there's some legalese in that respect of how do you agree that these are sovereign nations, but to Indigenous people and to myself, it's just they're a sovereign nation. Like you don't have to jump through so many legal hoops, well, unless you're a lawyer, I guess, but there's a lot of discussion about that to be had as well. But to summarize what tribal sovereignty really is, and it's really the authority of Indigenous communities and groups and nations to exercise self-government. So again, we go back to the idea that this was an agreement typically made between the United States and these Indigenous communities, talking more in the North America sense. But really, again, these tribal governments have been exercising self-determination for thousands of years from some cases. But they have their own governance structures, their laws, their law enforcement, and their tribal courts. Now, I think what's at the core of self-governments when you're talking about tribal sovereignty is the ability to protect Indigenous communities and identities and cultures. So the protection of culture and identities as it's taught and pervaded and held together now, but also as it's passed on through the next, as you would say, 7 generations. So I'll kind of summarize this really wordy diagram here, but essentially, like when you think about tribal sovereignty, you really got to put in the context of what's currently ongoing with Indigenous nations within the United States as well as Canada. And you can put that definitely in a technical aspect of certain barriers in terms of access to internet, basic infrastructure, and things like that as well. But you got to also look at what's going on, as you would say, Indian country in terms of their own policies of how they're developing their own regulatory commissions in the environment as well as technology environment. And how does that interact with outside forces like the United States government or state government? Of course, I think that also plays together in the economic context of what is the money that's being transferred within and without the tribal communities as well as tribal nations as well. And that in itself is its own theory of thought of how do we develop an economic context that is not taking advantage of indigenous people in this capitalist system. Like, how do we, exist in this capitalist system without, I guess, playing up the evils of it? And, how do we develop that? And how do we go about existing as an indigenous person in an indigenous way, but also in a capitalist sense? How do we go about doing that? Or is that even necessary? So there's still a lot of discussion about how you do that. What are you valuing in the economic context as well? But I think it goes back to that security context of, like, you want to take care of your people, both with, food, environment, in terms of agriculture, education, but also the security of our own culture. And how do you do that, in the system that we're living in? And then also, how can you use space technology to touch on all of these aspects of protection? So typically when you're doing this type of analysis, and when you want to use systems architecture engineering, which is just a way of looking at a really complex system of how do all these different pieces move around, is you usually start with a stakeholder analysis. So now I was looking at tribal sovereignty specifically, and I wanted to understand who are the stakeholders within that whole system of tribal sovereignty, going back to that frame of context that we just spoke about with that green diagram. But I wanted to focus on something really important in this case, is that when I'm talking about tribal sovereignty, I'm not just speaking about the elected self-government. So the people that are actually leading the tribe, usually a president or a chairman, or even a chief in some cases. But you also have these traditional knowledge keepers that are primary stakeholders in this case, because those are the folks that are actually passing on the culture, the value system, and determining what is right and wrong as we're moving forward in the world. So in this case, I'll note that within tribal sovereignty, which very broadly can be applied to so many different indigenous groups, you have these different economic contexts, these health contexts, land and natural resource management, but also tribal governments in general. But again, what unites all that and what it's building is this protection of community and culture. So again, going back to one of my first slides earlier, is that the primary goals and purpose of tribal sovereignty is, again, that security context and that protection of not just what is happening right now with our own generations, but also protecting that so other generations in the future can hold that same power and knowledge. So, I mean, this is something that I had to sit and think about in some way. And when I did that, I realized that in many respects, satellite-based Earth observation is already being used to advance or protect tribal sovereignty. And there's several cases where indigenous nations, and I'll rely on my Navajo nation, are actually using space technology right now to monitor their own resources. There was a moment where they actually wanted to build and buy their own satellite too, to monitor the natural disaster that happened with the Gold King mine disaster. And so there was a lot of instances where indigenous people traditionally have used satellite-based Earth observation in the past, but there is a growing number of the recognition that this technology can actually be used to help indigenous people. And with that, there's indigenous communities and people that are wanting to build their own satellite programs, wanted to do it for land and natural resource management, economic development, but also what's at the basis of this is what I've noticed is that they really want to build these type of systems and capabilities for education. And going back to those instances in that agreement that NASA had with the Navajo Nation with Lunar Prospector, is that they want to build that educational context and competency for their youth, but without them forgetting about their community or their culture in that context as well. And also, I know I'm covering the last part down here, so I'll move myself over. But tribal governments, I think there's a recognition of the power that indigenous people have and indigenous nations have at a global context. And you're actually seeing this play out now at COP26, as well as the UN delegation there, in terms of indigenous people actually becoming one of the world players there, and rightfully so, as sovereign nations there too. So satellite-based Earth observation, definitely allows them to apply and be leaders and exist in this more global system of all these space systems orbiting us. So again, I apologize for the very messy diagram that I have here, but what I want to highlight again is, like, similar to how I'm looking at tribal sovereignty, who are the primary stakeholders when we're talking about using satellites for tribal sovereignty? is that I'm not just considering the elected tribal government, the leaders that are communicating with other nations. They're not the only stakeholders that are making decisions here, and that should be included in the development. But we also have to include those traditional knowledge keepers and who they are in the community, because that incorporating them in can also help guide us to prevent those conflicts that we see with the Mauna Kea telescope, the lunar prospector, and prevent that loss of cultural value system and that context that we don't want to see lost in Indigenous youth too. So to summarize this as well, is that how do you incorporate in those traditional knowledge keepers is a question that I'm still trying to understand and figure out now, and something that within my own PhD research is figuring out how to build that relationship with traditional knowledge keepers, their own community, their own engineers, but also with outside organizations like NASA, SpaceX, Blue Origin, is how do you build that relationship? And I kind of go back onto that lunar prospector resolution. Well, how do they do that? And they did it in an Indigenous way, through a talking circle, through meeting, through building in-person relationship as equals. And I think that's so powerful, and something that not just I can take away, but all of you can take away in a certain sense. Like, I encourage you to learn more about that. Look at the power of building relationships in a certain sense and maintaining them. Like, that's just part of being a human. And I think that needs to be incorporated. I don't want to say reincorporated into space technology development and exploration, because I don't even know if it really has. But having that diplomacy, that ability to sit down as equals and communicate and take our time in that respect, can help us clear up a lot of these different conflicts. And one thing that I'll leave you all with, and this is not like a doomer type of thing, but this is a really stark quote that I took from a paper that came out in the 70s. So during the height of the Apollo era, this group of Indigenous scholars actually met, and they talked about, and critiqued the Apollo programs that were going on at the time. And they saw, how people were talking about it, how people viewed it. And one of the main ideas and quotes that came out of this was pity the Indian and buffalo of outer space. And I think what they were speaking to at that time was definitely the idea of preventing manifest destiny again happening in space exploration. So I'll leave you all with that, but I'd love to have a few questions and conversation. I know I didn't really touch too much on my research here. That'd be like another 2-hour long conversation. I feel like I'm really long-winded, so I apologize, but thank you again for letting me come here and speak, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think Colin is going to moderate the Q&A portion here. So Colin, if you have any questions as folks are preparing, either typing them in the chat so that we can relay them, or preparing to verbally ask those questions, please feel free to raise your hand as well if you would like to verbally ask a question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a small group, so if anyone wants to raise their hand or just toss your question in the chat. While that's happening, I'll first say thank you, Alvin. That was incredible. And for those of you who are here, we do have some more events coming up. I wanted to highlight tomorrow, our co-hosts, the Afro-Indigenous Futures group at the New School, are hosting a talk, which is including Grace Dillon, on Indigenous futurisms. So that might be of interest to all of you. We also have a few more talks, et cetera, coming up over the coming weeks. So please check those out. I think links are hopping into the chat. I have to think about where I'd want to start with questions for this, so I understand what everyone listening must be going through. There is so much here. Thank you. And I see Nick's on deck, so maybe I'll pass it off to him quickly, and then I'll jump in with some of my own.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Alvin, again, for coming and speaking with us. So I guess I've got several questions, so I'll start with the first one, which is I'll start with one and then perhaps circle back to it. So one thing that you mentioned was the relationship between the historic relationship between the various tribes and nations indigenous to Turtle Island, commonly known as North America, and the federal government, and the, let's say, fraught relationship that has often been established. And I'm wondering, or that has existed. And so I'm wondering, when you're communicating with, when you yourself, or if you have communicated with NASA or through these groups, like you mentioned that you're a part of this outreach and mentorship group, are you finding that they are generally receptive to some of the critiques that you've raised here, like the Mauna Kea protests and whatnot? And what can you speak a little bit to how you're seeing efforts like your own, the reception that you're having, or other peers that you have in your network and growing network and supporters? Just what temperature check, what's going on, what are you experiencing?
Yeah, definitely. There's so much support, I think, especially nowadays. And I think that's like a reflection of what's going on in our society right now with the land back movement, the land grant college, or a land grab college, I guess you can say, as well as, Black Lives Matter too. I think, like us being at home because of COVID, and, I can speak to my own experiences being here at MIT, is like, I think what has been going on like in the past couple of years has really pulled back that veneer, or, that illusion of what we're doing in space is diverse, it's democratic, it's something that's for the benefit of all humanity. And I think people are like really starting to recognize that that's not how it's been going. That there's so much work that we need to do, especially in incorporating in Indigenous people and allowing them to be Indigenous in this respect. And I think there's so much support, like I would say at the middle and like bottom level, and I think maybe even some respect at the top levels of like leadership and things like that too. But for whatever reason, like a lot of the conversations, these type of talks, the agreements, the strength and support, like it has a hard time reaching those top levels. And I think a lot of that's political based, or a lot of it, I can speak to like what's going on at NASA. Like there's like the whole working groups dedicated to kind of figuring out like how can we develop an Indigenous office there, or an Office of Tribal Affairs there at NASA. But there's also other organizations that are trying to figure out, do we need an office like that too? Like, well, how do we go about doing that? I think is like the question that we're at now, which, I think is good that we've gotten to that point of like asking like, how do we actually do that? But I also, have a bit impatience on that, on that viewpoint too, is like, you like, even here at MIT, we have millions of dollars in resources and things like that as well. And you can develop a rocket, you can build a new lab in a couple months, or maybe even less than a year. But why does it take decades to build an Indigenous Affairs office, like, or to build a competency with anti-colonial theory, or what you're doing in space? Like, how do you develop your value system and ethics? Like, it takes so long to do that when you're quickly doing all these other things. So, like, I understand, like, these are things that you have to take your time and like, build out and really come to understand. But there's been people doing that for careers, decades, their whole livelihoods are based around that. And I can speak to all of my mentors like Natalie Trevino, Dr. Natalie Trevino, and Dr. David Malley, Dr. Albert Marshall. Like, they've all been doing this type of work for years. And many of them are Indigenous themselves, and I'm sure that they would love to be involved, at those upper levels, to have those conversations and to build those type of offices too. So I hope that answers your question, Nick.
It does. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have a question in the chat here from Annie. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it is, how do you view interactions between sovereign nations across the globe? You can probably take that in a lot of directions, but.
Yeah, I think, like, I'll first speak with like about Indigenous sovereign nations. It's very different in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, especially, about these different commissions at the federal level there that they have in those nations, about how are they managing these conflicts, how are they reconciling that history. And the United States, it's still very fraught. like especially with the history of boarding schools, like it was discovered, I think last year, like those hundreds of children that have perished and passed away in the boarding school system. And I know a lot of people in the United States saying like, yeah, that happened here too. like we need to reconcile that history and build that commission and build that leadership in that respect too. So like when I look at how First Nations are treated in Canada, how they are incorporated in their own, Canadian government system, as well as in New Zealand and even Australia, like it really pervades how they're incorporated in those space programs. So the Canadian space program, the New Zealand space program, Australian space program, like Indigenous people are up at that level already. Like they're, I don't want to say built into the system, but like they are there helping to lead, this discussion of values, like, that Office of Tribal Affairs that we've been fighting for a long time. Like they have that in there like a long time ago already. And that is giving them the strength that they need to help facilitate these discussions. I mean, I'm sure they would say that they want to do it better, or we need more resources and stuff like that. But I mean, I would love to see us get to that point too. But I guess more broadly, like in terms of, sovereign nations in the world, like I'm not exactly a political scientist, so I can't really speak to like, relationships between, China and the United States or anything else like that. But, I will go back to the values of, building a relationship, using the values of talking circles to facilitate conflict management, to facilitate agreements. Like I don't know, like especially like engineers, like we get in the mindset of like whoever speaks the fastest, whoever wins this debate, points out the most facts, like that somehow makes you a winner in the agreement or gets you the upper hand. Whereas, the Indigenous way would ask you to slow down, to come to an understanding of how each other feel, and actually reach a resolution based around that, and to think forward, not presently, just presently or what's behind us, but also think forward in how we're going to build those relationships.
Thank you for that. I'm going to call on Jose, who we are glad could join us, and then we'll have another question in the chat after that.
Hello, Alvin. Thank you so much for the talk and for participating also I'm one of the organizers of the Afro Indigenous Futures series of events. And this is just like on spot, this kind of talk. So thank you for that. And my question is, how do you see the relationship between North American indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples from around the world? Because it seems to me that North American indigenous positionality, in spite of it's like settler colonial situation, has like an advantage to interpolate US based institutions. But how do other indigenous nations are simply, other indigenous nations from around the world are simply too far from these institutions to have this kind of interpolation. So I'm wondering about that.
It's a really good question. I think, there's a core value set that I think, really unites indigenous people. And it kind of goes back to like how I'm defining tribal sovereignty, especially like that protection of their culture and their community, and maintaining and building relationships in a way that is based around reciprocity. I guess I think I said that right, reciprocity. But the idea of like whatever that you're going to take from the land, like we want to put that back in there out of respect. So there's that balance of like equity within our systems and relationship with our land, the land that we're on, but also with people, and building that respect in that way. And for a long time, there's been a real imbalance in that, a lot of injustices in that respect. So there's a lot of commonalities in addressing that injustice, and figuring out how to use the systems that we exist in now, like with capitalism, the markets, but also in terms of our educational institutions. So educational institutions like tribal colleges and universities are amazing places to really begin to build that type of network and that international collaboration and cooperation. And it's really interesting that you brought up that question, because like just last week, like here at MIT, the Native American students met with one of the ministers from Ecuador, from the Indigenous Affairs Office that they have there. And he actually wants to come and build that international relationship, not just with MIT, but also tribal colleges and universities here, because he's actually starting his own tribal or indigenous university based around STEM there in Ecuador for indigenous people. So I think like there's that recognition of the power of the institution, like an educational institution, and building that relationship and kind of bridging those like international things, especially around projects and research and kind of like I mentioned before, existing in the system, I guess, of how can we build this capacity, but also hold our culture and protect our tribal sovereignty in that way. So you see a lot of that. I would love to see that in the space context, of course, like having NASA's Tribal Affairs Office link up and collaborate and build capacity with indigenous people around the globe. Like there's a lot of potential for leadership in that way. And even right now, I think there'd be potential for leadership for the other space agencies around the world that are already incorporating in indigenous people. So I hope that answered your question, Jose.
Yeah, it did, and I'm so excited about that that piece of news.
Yeah, it's going to be.
I'm from Ecuador, actually.
Oh, you're from Ecuador?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really exciting to have, or to try to build that capacity here at MIT too, because it's a big school, I guess you can say. But like, we definitely want, like we're asking NASA, we're asking, actually asking MIT to build that capacity to help, lead that relationship building with indigenous people, and to have indigenous people here build those international relationships and answer those questions that are really confronting these indigenous communities. MIT has money to spare to do that. I think a lot of like big institutions like NASA or Harvard, like they have money to spare to support indigenous people and their research and letting them lead these initiatives too, which I think is really important to look at as well. But yeah, we'll hopefully let everyone know about how that relationship goes. And maybe we can have actually an Indigenous Research Center here at MIT too. So we'll see how that goes.
That would be an extremely exciting project. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. Following up on Lena's question in the chat here, I believe the question is about North America and Turtle Island Indigenous perspective on the main risks and dangers of developing mining in outer space. I think that question around mining is particularly juicy. So love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just this past week, I participated in a space business like challenge. So that those things kind of pop up every once in a while, where they're usually like come and like build a team with random people, or build one yourself at your own university, and we'll give you a challenge and then build a business around that in like a week, and then come back to us and like, we'll grade it, I guess. And it's like a competition where you could win money and whatnot. But this prompt that we were given just past week with this team that I was on was based around that question of, how can we mine the moon in an efficient and sustainable way, which was really interesting, is that idea of sustainability as we're mining and doing extraction. Like, is that something that we even know how to do here on Earth? like how do we actually do that, in a respectful way? And I think that's what people really hang up on, is like, what do you mean respectful way? Like sustainably? Like, are we going to reduce our carbon footprint? Like as we're building trucks and stuff to go strip mine this area? Like, what does that really mean? I think, for a lot of indigenous people and the traditional folks, that mining in that sense and extraction, that is something that we experience that is so vast and damaging and harmful, is something that we don't want to see happen, on the moon or really elsewhere in the world. Because, we see the firsthand damage to indigenous lives, not just indigenous lives, I guess everyone's lives, of the global pollution and the environment, that, it doesn't just affect the people that are living there, but it affects everyone. And that extractive process, talked about doing that on the moon. Like people will argue that there's nothing living up there, or that, it's not an environment, as I spoke about earlier. But I think you really do have to consider that part of the environment, and that, the moon has its own spirit. It has its own, like personhood in a certain sense that really needs to be respected. And so the danger there, I think, is if we decide to just go out there and mine the moon because we're going to make good money, or because we can, that we're going to run into the same problems of values and ethics that we have here. That we're going to run into the problem of that we're extracting so much that we're irreparably damaging the moon, or that we're taking so much that we're going to have a runaway lunar economy that is just going to increase the disparities that we see here on Earth. So if we don't do this in a respectful way, I'll preface this too, is like, I'm not against being there on the moon. I just think we should do it in a more respectful way. And I, even as an Indigenous person, don't really have the answer of how to do that by myself. And I think that's one thing about all of this too, is I think we all get kind of caught up in like, we're looking for people, one person with the answer. Is I think we have to move away from that idea of the one like genius scholar. Like, it really takes a community of people to assess these questions and to come up with an answer, or a process of how to do this respectfully. So I think we're seeing that building up now. We'd love to see that more at the upper levels, I think, but definitely, like, there's still a lot of questions of how we can do that respectfully.
100%. I think it's also not just the answers, but having the right questions and the right frames. So I really appreciate what you're bringing to that. I also, what I'd add to that is something we think about at NSPDOS a fair bit in our conversations is, even if there isn't an environment on the moon, we are in fact bringing an environment, a culture with us. And so there was that question as well. I see Nick's hand. I'm going to go to a question in the chat quickly from John, I think, Rodriguez. That is, beyond the nascent space race, don't you think that this is a great moment for the Indigenous nations to contribute their cosmogony in making human life multiplanetary? And just for people in the recording, I just had to look up what cosmogony is. It's the science of the origin of the universe. And so I think we can think of that broadly in this sense at the moment. But I just wanted to bring a quick curricular definition of that word for us.
Well, thank you, Colin, because I was trying to figure that out myself. So cosmogony, I'll have to remember that word. That's really neat. Yeah, I think like becoming interplanetary comes with a lot of questions. And when you start to look at those questions, it's the same questions that we're still trying to confront here on Earth, especially with, where are we going as a society and as a culture and as a human race? How are we doing things that are treating our environment around us? Like, you can't become a multiplanetary species without addressing those questions that we're still having today. Like, in my opinion, that, those things, those processes, those relationships need to be built, now before we become an interplanetary species. Because if we just take like right now, like everything that we have right now and send it to Mars, like, geez, is that even going to work? Is we going to have a more marginalized society that's so far away? Is capitalists going to be like runaway there, where we have total control over food and the resources there? Like, I think there's so many questions that need to be answered here on Earth. And that doesn't mean that we can't, shoot for and think about becoming interplanetary, especially as Indigenous people. But I think definitely, like, in terms of building that relationship with our spirit and our land and amongst each other, is definitely a cosmogony, I guess, that needs to be held here on Earth and figured out with the people around us before we think about or become interplanetary too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always like to point out that people like Musk talk about going and terraforming Mars, and I think it would be a lot easier to deal with the climate crisis on Earth rather than run away from it to terraform a different planet. Terraforming starts here. Nick.
Yeah, I think just to follow what you said, Colin, I think I share that a lot too. It's like, well, we can do both. Like, we can both invest billions of dollars into rockets going into space and then invest a couple million in solving environmental problems. But I don't know, can we? Like, I always find myself asking that question. I don't have an answer, but anytime I hear that, I'm like, can we? Like where we're going with all this money, or where people are going with all this money, like, do we really understand, or do we really believe that we're doing both properly? Like, is it a balance? Is it 10% and 90%? Like, how do you determine that too? And I don't have an answer, but it's something that I'm always asking myself. And I feel like people are also afraid to like bring up is like, are we really doing both? Which I don't know. I'm sorry, I think Nick or Emma had a hand up.
Yeah, I think we'll go to Nick and then Emma from there.
Fantastic, thank you. You already kind of got at this question, but I'm curious as to your thinking about perhaps we can say formerly colonized territories or nations or states that are working to extend themselves into space. So I'm going to refer to the African Union and its recent creation and formalization of the African Space Agency and the structure to do that. And this is a Pan-African effort. Just your thoughts on states and formerly perhaps colonized territories that are extending into space. Given the context, do you think that this is going to turn out fruitfully for the peoples of those territories, or what do you think are the things that we should be thinking through as folks are engaging in these efforts?
That's a really good question. Definitely that is already going on. Like, you have the Intertribal Space Agency here in the US, ran by Dan Hawk. You also have the Cherokee Space Agency, which I think is relatively new as well. And you have different tribes and communities trying to figure out how to do that, how to have their own space agency essentially. And what I see from those is a lot of them are I guess business focused, I guess you can say, and definitely like the playing into the commercialization of space. But I think utilizing that commercialization and that money that's there and that public perception there to build those capacities of education, to build those capacities of monitoring their own land and resources and management. So kind of going back to like, that one slide I had where these are the capacities that Earth observation can actually be used for to advance tribal sovereignty. Like, I see that a lot already, and I also see like in the case of the Intertribal Space Agency is like they want to develop space technology to bring people to the table, indigenous people to the international table as leaders and as people that have essentially some modicum of control over the lunar environment or just the space environment itself. Is like, I think the one project that they had was that they wanted to build these lunar power stations, and that would be a way for companies, agencies to say like, well, if we want to operate on the moon, like we have to go through this Intertribal Space Agency and go through their rule system, like respecting the environment. So essentially it's that space agency wanted to develop itself as kind of a stopgap or a gate into the lunar surface or even into space. But that gate is very much monitored by an indigenous person or indigenous people too. So I think like right now, there's so much interest in what's going on, and what I really want to see, like personally, what would prevent so much conflict in the future and really advance tribal sovereignty in terms of protection of community and culture is the incorporation of traditional knowledge keepers. And so kind of going back to that stakeholder analysis that I was proposing was that you don't just have like these elected leadership or people in this case, indigenous people starting these space companies, but you also want to incorporate in these traditional knowledge keepers to help guide the value system of that entire space system, and to also like talk about the protection of that culture within that system itself. Like, we don't want to lose ourselves as we're developing space technology. We don't want to lose our cultures, our values, and become what we're trying to essentially fight against in a certain respect, is this loss of people and this one of my mentors put it so harshly, but so correctly, is this murder of the mind and this murder of the spirit that Indigenous people are experiencing as they're going off to learn about these space technology things or off to go to NASA. Like, we don't want that to happen anymore. And to me, like, I think the way that you incorporate that is you build in these structures that allow traditional knowledge keepers to be part of the leadership there and to be part of the mentorship too. So that's also part of what I'm trying to figure out to do with my PhD thesis as well, is building that relationship in that capacity. So we'll definitely see how that goes, but I see a very positive horizon in incorporating that in with these rising Indigenous space agencies too. So.
Fantastic, thank you. And I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you about those efforts.
Definitely, that'd be great, Nick.
Thank you. We'll go to Emma.
All right, so apologies for being camera off, and I think you were just sort of speaking to this, but on the topic of ways to avoid a simple recreation of colonization or late stage capitalism or what have you in space, in some of the humanities and social sciences, there's been some discussion about using like science fiction and other very quote unquote non-academic ways of thinking as like a way to sort of spark the imagination and prevent just the retreading of these same systems. I'm wondering, from the more STEM perspective, are you encountering things related to sort of imagination and speculation or even science fiction? Is that, just sort of in terms of imagining a future that, is not just a retreading of the past?
Yeah. I think I'm laughing because I'm like, a lot of like space technology and research is in itself speculative. Because like, NASA, or even like as a researcher like involved in this, was like, you can speculate on when we're gonna have people in space again, or what is the body gonna do, or like anything like that. Like, it's all relatively speculative still. Like, it's all still, you can frame it as science fiction. I know a lot of my colleagues probably would hate that because it makes it sound like it's made up, but I mean, so much of it is still, speculative and trying to understand, how do people interact with space? Like, where do we go with that society and everything else like that? Even like technical research, like looking at how to build a society in the space, like a lot of it is still based around speculative science fiction thought. Like a lot of science fiction already kind of did that, laying the groundwork of like, if we had a society on Mars, like, is it going to look like this? And so technical research looking at that is either saying like, there's parts of that that probably are real, or that's all like BS and we're not going to do it that way. So I mean, a lot of it is still speculative based, but I think what is interesting though is that I can go to probably NASA administrator, I can go to Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and present the most technically sound paper explaining to them why they should have Indigenous people at their leadership or Indigenous values incorporated in their space exploration, and they probably wouldn't care. I think, there's so much power that storytelling has in its many different forms. And even like here at MIT, if I want to go speak with an administrator about hiring Indigenous faculty, I could spit out all these numbers, but what they really need to hear is a story of why that history matters, why they need Indigenous people. And to be able to tell that story is something that is part technical, but also part, I guess, that speculative fiction that you talk about, is that, we can talk about a story that envisions a better future that we can use technology to figure out, but that really requires, human people and building those relationships too. So I think, even like with Indigenous people, the power of storytelling is just, so potent. And I think, you see that in popular culture today with science fiction and, how people think about and view space. But entering into these conversations with these leadership to advocate for these technical aspects will always require some sort of story to tell, and a story that impacts them, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, which I think people really leave out. Proposals and things like that, like the storytelling component like needs to be there in a certain sense. And I mean, it depends on where you're at, to be honest. I mean, I can't tell a whole story about myself to a proposal committee or something like that, depending on where I go. But I mean, it's always comes back to the idea of storytelling. And I think that's incredibly powerful and needs to be utilized when having these conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, the one thing I might add to that is thinking about a lot of sci-fi that does exist. Thank you, Emma. Is a lot of it itself retraces kind of colonial myths and patterns. A lot of sci-fi follows that same path. It's embedded in it. And so what might be needed is new stories, new science fiction. On that account, we just reposted some links in the chat, but tomorrow Grace Dillon is talking about Indigenous futurisms. And then she's also joining a panel on the 19th of speculative sci-fi authors who are going to be doing some live speculative storytelling. So that should be a really interesting one for you as well. That's the Imagined Lunar Communities, Hope, Habitation, and Humanity. So trying to pull in the human to the conversation of that. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up? I'm not seeing anything in the chat at the moment.
Or Alvin, do you have anything that you have thought that you want to put forward before we wrap up? Anything else?
I think there's one thing that I guess I'll pass on is, having these conversations like wherever you're at, and talking about and confronting colonialism, like especially in space exploration, like there's always going to be some sort of resistance or confrontation in that sense. You're always going to get some sort of pushback, usually from somebody. And I think it takes a lot of bravery on your part to like speak out against that. And I see more and more brave people every day taking up these conversations and having these critiques and these discussions occur. And I think that gives me a lot of bravery myself, I guess, to know that there's people out there that are doing something that is really quite sacred in understanding what is essentially your own personal journey in a certain sense of your relationship with what you're doing, with the industry that we're all in are interested in, our own place within this earth, I guess I should say, but within this society and within our relationships with people and with this earth. So I understand that it takes a lot of bravery, and I know a lot of people have definitely been ostracized for speaking out against the way that space exploration is done or talked about. And just take heart that there's a lot of people that are behind you and what you're doing and what you're saying, and that we can build this community and we can build this leadership where we can have this impact, and an impact that we're already seeing with organizations like the one that invited me to speak to this too, is that we can begin to have that conversation and that community and build that relationship with each other and talk about our own relationship with space exploration. So I thank you all. Like I said, I consider you all my relatives in these conversations and talks. So, let's keep it that way. Let's continue to speak and talk more and, learn from each other. I definitely don't have all the answers. I'm still a student. I think that's one thing to remember too, is like, everything I say, like it maybe might, be improved upon, I guess, by the next coming years, or maybe some things will be different too. And I think we need to respect that too, that process of continuous learning from each other and with ourselves. I mean, we can't be the only expert when we talk about these problems. So let's keep working together. Let's do this.
May we all remain students. Thank you, Alvin, for everything tonight. I've seen a lot of really great comments and thanks in the chat for you speaking today. So Nespiros, thanks you for your time. I'm sure I'll speak for what Jose can say, but other Indigenous futures, thanks you for your time. And we will be in touch going forwards with the recording. We'll be on our YouTube channel. We hope to see everyone at future events.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.